programs as means to reduce poverty, challenges and opportunities. Pro-poor growth or anti-poor, as a kid would say. We have promised to end poverty in all its forms everywhere by 2030. That's Sustainable Development Goal number 1. SDG 1 calls to end poverty, ensure social protection for the poor and vulnerable, to increase access to basic services, and to protect families from the impact of economic shocks, natural disasters, and other crises. Evidence, and it's dangerous to talk about evidence with all the academic personnel here today, but evidence and experience point to social protection and cash transfers as both necessary and efficient tools in the fight against poverty. Cash transfers are shown to have an impact on a range of outcomes simultaneously. For instance, high rates of school attendance are consistently accompanied by a reduction in child labour, according to the World Bank. On the other hand, although cash transfers lead to an increase in school attendance, it does not always lead to improved learning outcomes. Yeah, you're not. That's good. Direct support to cash transfers has until recently been quite modest in the Norwegian aid budget. However, social protection is complementary to other efforts. For example, in the fields of education, which is one of the 5 main priorities in the Norwegian development budget. When children go hungry to school, they are not able to pay enough attention. Cash transfers can be important to ensure that they do. Then we have the question, how to do. An important feature of social protection systems is that they have a potential to support growth through preserving and building human capital. To educate a girl is particularly a good investment. Women with education have fewer, more educated and healthier children. As for all the SDGs, aid alone is not the solution to eradicate poverty. Domestic resource mobilization is needed, including the establishment of national social protection systems. It's therefore promising that more countries now include social safety nets in their own national budget. Norway supports efforts to improve tax systems and tax collection in many countries. This increases the growth potential of the economy, strengthens public finance, while at the same time reducing inequality. The use of cash transfers rather than in-kind assistance is relevant to many emergencies or emergency situations, both to address current needs, but also in contributing to more long-term stabilization and development objectives. Social protection can be key to linking humanitarian and long-term development efforts, as well as ensuring resilience and prevention of conflict. The role of cash transfers is part of the government's current work with a new strategy for humanitarian aid, which is to be launched this fall, that means August, September this year. The government will have a new humanitarian strategy. I look forward to listening to the presentations today and the debate on this important topic. I wish you all an interesting meeting, and I will now give the floor to today's moderator, Eva Brakke. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Today's topic seems to catch a lot of interest these days. It's on the front page of The Economist this week, and there is a number of bistandsaktuelt for you Norwegian reading about safety nets and cash transfers. It generates also a lot of academic interest. If you try to Google it, you are overwhelmed of the reports. So we really need to lay a groundwork here with facts and figures. Unfortunately, we have a capacity to do that. Stephen Kidd, CEO of Development Department from the UK. Dr. Stephen Kidd is a senior social protection specialist at Development Pathways, with more than 30 years' experience of engaging in social development and social protection. Please, Dr. Kidd, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for for asking me to come here and speak on this issue. I think it's, as we've heard, it's an incredibly important issue now, and it's a very hot topic in many low and middle income countries. What I'm not going to go today, and we just had a very brief introduction, is very much into the impacts of social protection. I think that's very clear. This has very, very significant impacts on poverty, human development, and a range of other areas. What I want to go into more is looking more at the sort of debates around the design of systems that are taking place in low and middle income countries. Now, I just want to start quickly by putting up this quite provocative. The poor are a fictional construct, right? I think we really need to understand poverty much better if we're going to design social protection programs much better, and I think there's a lot of confusion around this. So we often talk about a very simple dichotomy of the poor and the non-poor, as if there were two very static groups called the poor and the non-poor, and we have to design our social protection programs to help the poor. But when we talk, I think that is far too simple a distinction. In reality, as you can see here, in most low and middle income countries, we'd find that the vast majority of people are living in what we should regard as poverty, and many in extreme poverty. A very tiny group would be above $10 purchasing power parity per day, which $10 because this has to be measured in the United States context, would be very, very low levels of income and high degree of poverty. And most people are living, or many people are living in poverty under $4 a day, which is very little to get by. And in many countries, you have the majority living on less than $2 a day. So to think that there's only a small group called the poor really confuses our thinking. Secondly, we also have to remember that people are subject to risks all the time. Many of these risks and challenges that they face are around the life cycle. Risks from early childhood all the way through to old age. Now, I don't have time to go through this sort of in detail, but this is very, very important to understand, because any of these risks and challenges can hit families hard and make a significant drop in their standards of living. And children in particular, many children suffer from the scourge of stunting, which hits their cognitive development. But even having a child when you're at working age, a mother having a child is a massive hit to the family. Often the mother has to leave work, and you have the additional cost of a child, and that will really knock you down in terms of your standards of living. And of course, as you get to be old, then you increasingly become less able to engage in the labour market, become more dependent on people. That means that working age families then have to help you a lot more financially, which means it takes away from their ability to invest in their own children. And we all face these risks around our lifestyle. We have to bear this in mind. And of course, disability is a major risk and illness that can hit us at any time around the life cycle, but becomes more prevalent in old age. And so within that context, when we're looking at who are the poor in poverty, we need to see that actually people's standards of living change quite rapidly. So these are a couple of graphs we've done a lot of these around the world. So looking at Uganda and Indonesia, but if you just look at the Indonesia one on the right, what we're looking in orange is in 2009, who were in the poorest 20%, moving up to who were in the richest 20% in green, and looking at each other quintile as we go up there in 2009, and where they were just 1 year later in the rankings. We find that of the poorest 20%, often called the poor, by 1 year later, 40% of them were new. Okay, and many people had changed around the middle. Many are on very low and insecure incomes, are changing all the time, and it's actually a very tiny group that stay at the top who don't really move, who are particularly secure. And this we need to bear in mind when we're designing our social protection systems, that actually a high number of people are living in poverty, a very high proportion of the population, the majority have very insecure incomes, and therefore the vast majority of people in low and middle income countries, as in our own countries, require social protection to give them this kind of stability and security that they require. Now, the big debate in social protection internationally, and you find this, is how to set up design social protection systems. Now, if we look here, said across the life cycle from childhood to working age to old age, a number of countries, often with the support of international donors, are setting up what I would refer to as poor relief programs for the poor. Very much what you had in Norway in the 19th century, okay, with the 1845 law and poor relief, etc. And these are sort of poor relief programs for the poor with conditions often linked to workfare or public works, etc. Right? It's a kind of model that we had in Europe in the 19th century, and many countries are still promoting that, and many development agencies still promote these kind of programs. And we see many examples around the world of programs. The whole system is just targeted at the poor, who I'd say are a fictional construct. The very poor group, often the poorest 10% or 15% of the population. Increasingly, the international community at a high level has got behind the idea of a social protection floor, which is a very sort of different approach at which we begin to address risks across the life cycle by putting in place certain social protection benefits across the life cycle. We address childhood, for example, through child benefits, as we have in our own countries, pretty much universal child benefits that we have. Old age, put in place an old age pension for every citizen once they reach old age. And disability benefits for those with severe disability, or support that people also to get into work who have disabilities. And then a range of other benefits for those working in unemployment, maternity, and survivors, programs for widows. They're the kind of most common benefits that we see in developed countries, the high-income countries, but increasingly we find these in low and middle-income countries. And it's a very different approach to the poor because these are generally much more inclusive programs, and it's about ensuring that everybody has access to these programs through the stages of their lives. And this is the kind of debate between these two paradigms, I think, of social protection. So just quickly, just to get a sense of how much we spend in our countries on social security, cash-based social security, you can see in OECD countries, this is a very high percentage of our budgets. It's the highest in most countries, higher than health and education. Norway, and these are OECD figures if you want to challenge them, you can see that around 10% of GDP is a significant benefit. So, or you're nodding your head, so changing on that. But it's generally a very significant amount. But as we see here, linked around benefits for the elderly, disabled, and people with disabilities and children are the main areas in which we put our investment. We evolved our systems from poor relief into these kind of systems. And we're beginning to see this similar process in developing countries. This is just a very quick graph to show the kind of levels of spending that we do get in some developing countries. Now this is different to the previous graph in that this is just systems financed from general taxation, whereas the previous graph also included social insurance schemes, or state social insurance schemes. So you can see that there are some countries which are actually spending quite a lot. Georgia, surprisingly, spending almost 7% of GDP on social protection at the moment, all government financed, mainly on a old age pension. A few countries are around 3% of GDP. Others are getting up to about 1% of GDP, mainly on pensions. But some countries are still spending very, very little, and some countries it's really just donor finance that they have, in very, very small proportions. So we do see a variety there, but we do have examples of low middle income countries that are actually investing quite a lot. Nepal's an interesting example. As one of the poorest countries in the world, is investing over 1.5% of GDP in social protection, mainly on an old age pension, child benefits and the disability benefits. So they're a model of showing that a very poor country can begin to invest in these kind of schemes. Now, one of the debates I saw for here is, so targeting, what is the best approach? Now, to targeting. Now, I think that there's actually quite an easy answer to this if you're looking at effectiveness. But it's key, I think, when we're looking at the target debate to identify one area, often of confusion, that we need to clarify, are we interested, if we're looking at social protection as a means of helping those living in poverty, in reaching the poor, or in targeting the poor? And often people misunderstand the difference. Reaching the poor is an objective. How are we best going to reach the poor? Make sure that people living in poverty access programs. Targeting the poor is just one means to that objective. But often it's thought of as if it is the objective, that we are going to target the poor, but it's just a means to an objective. Reaching the poor as an objective, clearly, if you give a program to everybody, it's much more effective in reaching those living in poverty because everybody gets it. All the evidence, and I'll show you, would point to that. Universal programs are much more effective in reaching the poor. If you want an old age pension, target everybody over 65, it's way more effective than targeting the poorest 20 or 30% of older people in terms of reaching the poor. And I'll show you some examples of that. But of course, universal programs are much more expensive. Okay, so this is the key trade-off. You have a much more effective system, but it's more expensive. Targeting the poor, what we find, because people's incomes are moving all the time, there's very little difference between the majority of the population and the level of their incomes. Targeted schemes usually tend to exclude the majority of people living in poverty. Okay, so they're not very effective as a technique. If you target the poor, you have to know you're making a choice of excluding at least 50% of those living in extreme poverty, but it's much cheaper. Okay, but being much cheaper is not necessarily an advantage, because I think one of the key messages we forget in social protection is that investing in social protection systems are a key economic growth strategy. And if it's going to help economic growth. You can see this in Europe, with the high levels of investment is very much part of our success. I don't have time to go into the different means in which social protection really helps promote economic growth. But if you spend too little, you're not going to get the benefits in terms of the growth in your economy. So targeting the poor is not necessarily, or having a cheaper system is not necessarily a good thing. So, what can we see in terms of the evidence? So I don't have much time to go through the evidence here in the very short time that we have available. But just to look here at a relationship between coverage and exclusion area in terms of programs around the world. By coverage, we're looking at the extent to which programs are becoming more universal, that they're covering a much higher proportion of their target group. And then the exclusion area is what proportion of the target population are actually excluded by those programs, of those that the program expects to reach. So we have here on the y-axis the coverage, so those at the top that we see, so the Mongolia Child Money, Mauritius Pension, etc., they're universal programs. Down to the targeted programs, which are those more down at the bottom right. And you can see in terms of the exclusion areas, and this is all work done from household surveys, national household surveys, etc., you can see the exclusion areas increase significantly the more that you target those living in poverty. So by the time you get down to, say, an example of Indonesia, which has a poor relief program, conditional cash transfer, targeted the poorest 5%, 93% of the poorest 5% are excluded from that program due to the targeting errors within that program. So they become much less effective, but much cheaper. Much more effective on the left, but more expensive, right? So this is a kind of basic thing that we have to understand. And a different way of looking at the sort of targeting areas, we're doing a lot more of these kind of graphs, looking at household surveys to see who are benefiting, who aren't benefiting, by putting the information on these in these kind of graphs. Where on these graphs you can see where we say lowest on the left to the highest on the right, that's from the poorest to the richest, according to the household survey. And those in the yellowish and greenish line are those who are receiving the program, and those above in the blue and red are those that aren't receiving the program. The red line, at this point in Ethiopia it's around 11%, and in Pakistan it's around just under 10%. All those to the left are those who are the target population for these programs. And then we're seeing how many are included and how many are excluded. And you can see in Ethiopia, the vast majority of those who are targeted for the program, meant to be on the program, are excluded. The error is around 80% in this famous productive safety net program. And in Pakistan, which is often shown as a very effective program in terms of its targeting, in fact the errors are over 60% in terms of the exclusion. And many people who are not who are not the target population are receiving the programs. Of course, they're still living in poverty, but they're not the target population, and it means that those who are the poorest, the very poorest members, those who are intended to be on the program, are being excluded. I can show you many more of these graphs. Some are a bit better, some are a bit worse. But it's a similar thing. And it's also interesting that there's some recent research just came out last month by the World Bank, which is showing in the Philippines, where you have a program. It's a bit better targeted. It has a exclusion area. Well, it's probably the best targeted program in the world with an exclusion area only just around 45% exclusion. But what they found, the World Bank, is that the program has increased stunting levels amongst non-beneficiary children by over 12 percentage points, a massive increase in stunting because of what had happened in the areas where they had their conditional cash transfer program, was that the beneficiary children, the parents, were then buying high protein foods, particularly eggs or meat, which had increased the price of those goods, hadn't increased the price of rice, etc., but increased the price of 2 or 3 things, fish, meat and eggs by about 10%, which meant that the non-beneficiary children, who were just as poor because of the targeting errors, couldn't afford to buy that protein anymore, and therefore stunting had increased. So it had to reduce stunting amongst the beneficiary children and increase stunting across the non-beneficiary children. Of course, if the program be given to every child in those areas, you wouldn't have had that problem. Okay, and in fact, the World Bank is saying where you have high coverage, at least in the Philippines, you should be moving to a universal program there. But these are very interesting because nobody's ever showing the negative impacts of targeting on the well-being of non-beneficiary families, again, living in poverty. Just then to see another example of a universal program. This is Georgia's old age pension. It's the same kind of graph. I could put up a number of these, would be similar. Because it's 100%, we don't have the red line because everybody's meant to be on the program. This is just looking at the target population of those over 65. And as you can see, there's virtually no exclusion of that. There's a small area of exclusion, very tiny, but the vast majority of those living in poverty, or 99%, are on the program. It's much more effective, but this is a very expensive program. Okay? What are the overall sort of broader impacts that we would then get? So one way of presenting this is to look and do some simulations through the household survey of what would be the levels of poverty without the programs and what would be the levels of poverty after the programs. Now this graph is looking at the Philippines, where you have this problematic program targeted at the poorest 20%, and South Africa's social grants, okay, which are a much larger set of programs, basically building a social protection floor based mainly around programs for older people, children, and people with disabilities with very high coverage. Now, you can see in the Philippines, which is only 0.4% of GDP, we're looking here at the graph from across age groups from children 0 to 4 years of age to older people, 85 plus at the very end. And the very top of the line shows the poverty rates without the programs for each age group. And then at the bottom of the top of the grey line, you can see the poverty rate after the program has been put in place. And you can see in the Philippines, even on the beneficiary, it has a very little impact on poverty. It's a very low amount of investment. So the impacts on poverty rates are very, very low. They're sort of tiny, negligible, with a level of investment of 0.4% of GDP. In South Africa, though, we find at over 3.5% of GDP of investment, much larger investment, we now find very significant drops in poverty amongst the population. In South Africa, poverty levels would be incredibly high without this level of investment in social protection. And amongst the elderly, because they put most of their investment in old age pensions, we have around about a 2/3 drop in the poverty rate amongst older people in South Africa. So very significant impacts, but this becomes because they're spending a lot more money. So they've gone to this trade-off, said, look, we're going to spend more and we'll have more impacts. This feeds into much bigger impacts on the economy in terms of social cohesion in South Africa. It's what's stopping South Africa exploding. It also feeds through into economic benefits. 3.5% of GDP is a lot of spending that people are doing, and that spending is helping entrepreneurs and business generate things. So that's another key element that you would get from that. And in the end, the kind of decision that countries have to make is, what do you want? Do you want to go for the type of Nordic social protection, let's say, the Rolls-Royce form of social protection? I'm sure you've got lots of problems on your design of your system still, and you complain about them. The kind of Rolls-Royce form of social protection, it's the same as buying a car. If you want a great car, you've got to spend the money. If you want a great social security system, you've got to spend the money. And if you don't spend the money, like the Philippines, or countries that spend even less than the Philippines, you'll end up with a second-hand larder poor relief, like you had in Norway in the 19th century, which you already rejected as the means of moving forward. So the question I would say, in terms of, which model do you want to promote? The one that you had in the 19th century, or the one that you have in the 21st century to developing countries? Because you find a lot of developing countries are trying to get behind the Rolls-Royce model of putting in place inclusive and universal schemes. Kenya this week, or last week and this week, is now just put in place a universal pension for everybody over 70 in Kenya at its own cost, which will make a massive difference to the lives of older people and others in Kenya. Many countries are doing that, and it is interesting. If you look at most of the inclusive or universal programs around the world, they are not supported by development partners. They are all financed by government, almost all of them, apart from one or two examples like Uganda, where DFID are supporting a universal pension. And most of the poverty-targeted poor relief programs are supported by development partners. It's a strange and interesting question why we've got to that kind of situation. And often the universal programs are opposed by development partners. I've written recently about Mongolia and the threats from the IMF and the World Bank to hold off loans unless it targets its universal child benefit. So we're often threatening these countries because they're not following this poverty-targeted model that we think is best, but really goes back to our 19th century experience. And politics, though, is very much at the root of this, okay, in terms of why are countries increasingly getting behind universal schemes. And it's because we look at the population, from the extreme poor to the middle class. If we target programs just at the extreme poor in a democratic context, they're not a very powerful group politically, okay? They're not going to win you an election. In fact, they're probably not going to vote in an election in a democratic context. So programs there, the middle class don't really want to support those programs and have their taxes because they don't benefit from them. If, however, you target your programs, as in South Africa, at a much larger group, say 70–80% of the population, you've built a coalition which can win you an election. Okay, this was very much part of the thinking in Kenya about, are we going to win an election? A universal pension will help us win an election. But of course, it's a great thing. That's actually what happened in our own countries. Okay, we built a much broader alliance, but still we're reaching people living in poverty in middle-income countries, who are highly insecure. And of course, the biggest alliance are the universal programs where everybody benefits, everybody pays their taxes, everybody benefits. The taxpayers are more willing to pay their taxes because they know they're going to benefit. So what we see in terms of the investment around the world in different types of schemes, I just looked here at the kind of tax finance schemes, pensions, disability benefits, child benefits, and the sort of poor relief programs. You do tend to find now, these are the highest spending programs that you can find in low and middle income countries of each type, that we do find that much more investment is going into the life cycle schemes such as pensions, disability benefits, child benefits where they are, and the programs that are targeted at the poor, as we would expect, have very low levels of investment. So I'll just move to end, and as we then see the results of that, you can see there's a natural experiment in a sense around the world where we have the most common type of social protection instrument or old age pensions in low and middle income countries. Some are universal, some are targeted at the majority of older people, and some are very much targeted. What you find here, what this graph is trying to show you, is that generally, and these are all countries that are regarded in the Economist Democracy Index that have a score of 5, so the more democratic context, we find a general relationship that the more democratic a country, the higher that we find that they have a higher value of transfer. Okay, so not only are you having higher coverage, you find that more inclusive programs, more universal programs, also pay much higher transfers than programs targeted at the poor. Okay, which goes against one of the arguments that people have of poverty targeting, that look, we can give higher transfers if we target the poor. In reality, the political economy would show that actually more universal programs, because they're more popular, have higher budgets, end up also paying much higher transfers to people, which therefore have much larger impacts. I don't have time to get into explaining the details of that graph. And then finally, I think, what is it that low and middle income countries should be aiming to invest in tax finance schemes? Our analysis, which suggests around 2 to 3% of GDP, would be something that countries should aim at. So we've been working with the government of Kenya on developing its system, and we're proposing, and